The spear didn't announce itself. No whistle, no tremor in the stone beneath him, nothing from the mountain to suggest anything was coming. One moment, Adrian Leonberger stood at the frozen ridgeline with the banner of a dead orc noble pressed under one boot and blood cooling on his blade. The next, the sky above the ridge cracked open. It struck 40 paces upslope, the impact carved through solid rock, one stroke, direct and merciless. Stone and frozen earth erupted outward in a wall of debris that knocked rangers off their feet and sent equipment skittering down the slope. When the dust finally settled, a shaft of black iron jutted from the mountainside at a low angle, thick as a man's torso, taller than a raised war banner, still trembling from the force of its delivery. The spear had come from the far side of the mountain range, miles away. Whatever held it had looked across an entire corridor of peaks, found the first prince of the kingdom standing at a ridgeline with a captured banner under his arm, and sent an acknowledgement. Without moving, without closing the distance, as a statement of interest. Adrian looked at the shaft. He looked at the mountain behind it. He looked at the rangers surrounding him, none of whom were doing a convincing job of appearing calm. He pulled the banner from under his boot, tucked it under his arm, and turned back toward Winter Castle. His legs were steady, his breathing even. The ancient presence behind those young eyes had endured wars that made this ridgeline look like a border incident. But it had also, across centuries of dormancy, developed a clear understanding of which threats required honest reckoning. This one did. He began walking. Quietly, he started calculating odds he didn't like. To understand how an entity that had stood at the founding of civilizations ended up doing unfavorable arithmetic on a frozen mountainside, you need to go back 3 months. Back to a royal armory, a very old sword, and the worst accident in the kingdom's recent history. Prince Adrian Leonberger was, by any honest measure, a disaster. The first prince of the kingdom, heir to the throne in theory, the court's collective burden in practice. He was obese in a way that implied years of determined effort in the wrong direction. His mana sensitivity was clinically broken, his cultivation capacity effectively zero. 3 of his assigned personal knights had returned their service crests and shattered their chain oaths rather than continue guarding him. The offenses responsible for those broken oaths were never discussed at full volume. The king, when he looked at his eldest son, wore the expression of a man still paying for a mistake that had already run past any chance of being undone. The court called him the rogue prince, without affection. On the night it happened, Adrian had gone alone to the ancestral vault. He lifted Gruhorn from its mount, the sword of the kingdom's first warlord, 6 centuries old, without a rust mark or a chip, kept sharp by something that defied natural explanation. He turned it in his hands, lost his footing. The blade pivoted inward and went through him cleanly, the way old weapons do when something inside them has kept them ready. He was dead before anyone found him. What the kingdom did not know, what the scholars had long since catalogued as romantic myth, was that Gruhorn was not only a sword. It was one of the oldest living martial entities in existence, a consciousness built through centuries of war, refined through thousands of duels, shaped by the grief and fury and devotion of every generation it had fought alongside. Older than the kingdom, it had helped found the kingdom. For 6 centuries, in that vault, it had waited while the bloodline it was bound to protect declined from legends into this. The rush of blood into the blade was apparently the key. The darkness ended. A body arrived, heavy, mana-starved, smelling of years of inactivity. The entity that had stood at the birth of kingdoms opened its new eyes to an unfamiliar ceiling and took stock. The inventory was not encouraging. The court noticed changes as the prince recovered from what was described as a near-fatal training accident. He stopped requesting elaborate meals. He spent hours in the inner courtyard working through slow, deliberate movement that looked like poor swordsmanship to anyone without context. He asked for histories of recent military campaigns, turned away visitors, and received the court's sneering correspondence without any of his former theatrical outrage, which unsettled observers more than anger would have. The mana sensitivity disorder was the first real obstacle. Gruhorn's martial foundation rested entirely on the mana heart, an ancient technique of condensing mana directly into the chest cavity, forging a core through sustained will and endurance. Modern knights used mana chains, rings of cultivated force wrapped around the body, stable, widely taught, and sensible. But chain technique could not access the martial poetry locked deepest in Gruhorn's memory. Incantations born from historical wars and personal vengeance. Patterns of power that had encoded themselves in verse over centuries. Only the heart could reach them. Queen Elena provided the necessary material, a private reserve of mana-dense tonic handed over without questions, with the manner of a woman who had stopped expecting specific outcomes from her eldest son and had settled for simply not standing in the way of unusual ones. 14 days of sitting cross-legged on stone followed. Mana pushed into channels that resisted it. The royal physician was called twice. Both times he left without a diagnosis, and with more uncertainty than he'd arrived carrying. At the end of the second week, something had settled in the center of his chest. Not comfortable, not warm. Nothing like the cultivation manuals described the chain process. A hard knot of condensed energy, small and dense as river stone, that hurt on every inhale and made sleep difficult for another week after that. The mana heart was forged, crude by the standard Gruhorn held internally, but sufficient. A beginning. He stood up from the stone floor, walked to the courtyard, and picked up a sword for the first practice session that was actually practice rather than physical archaeology. The body was still a problem. The stamina deficit alone was staggering. A dozen slow passes with a blade and the lungs were already announcing their complaint. But the mana heart had a secondary effect that the cultivation texts had deprioritized because they were written by people who'd never actually used one. It metabolized differently. Mana that would have pooled and stagnated was instead pulled through the core and burned. The weight began to leave. Not quickly, the ancestral soul did not expect miracles from a vessel it had inherited in this condition, but steadily, week over week, until the prince who looked at his reflection in the polished armor stand was recognizably a different shape from the one who had bled onto the vault floor. The sparring partners came voluntarily at first. The palace guards rotated in out of idle curiosity, expecting a repeat of the rogue prince's previous training performances, which by court reputation had been notable for duration of avoidance rather than duration of effort. They left with bruises and a revised opinion they weren't sure how to file. Count Bael Valorhard arrived 2 weeks after the mana heart was completed, and he arrived loudly. He was the brother of the late queen consort, massive-framed, with the particular bearing of a man who had spent 30 years commanding the kingdom's northern frontier and had stopped performing patience some time ago. He was also a quad-chain knight, close enough to the pinnacle of modern cultivation to make most people reevaluate their tone before finishing their sentences. The court feared him. The king respected him. Adrian's mother had loved him without reservation. He walked into the courtyard, looked at his nephew, and delivered his opening assessment with the candor the frontier teaches and the capital resents. He said the boy smelled like mana tonics and overambition. He said the mana heart was a peasant cultivation method that mercenaries used when they couldn't afford proper instruction, and that building a martial foundation on it was like laying a keep on sand. He had heard the rumors about palace guards going home with unexpected bruises, and he attributed that to guards who'd become soft from court postings. He bet 2 months of his garrison's equipment budget that the boy could not defeat a double-chain knight within 6 weeks. Adrian accepted the terms without raising his voice. What followed was not elegant. The first week involved a great deal of getting hit. The double-chain knight assigned as sparring partner was a young officer named Kale, conscientious and skilled, who pulled his strikes with professional care and still consistently put the prince on the ground. Gruhorn's martial memory was comprehensive and precise, and largely useless if the body carrying it couldn't execute the movement fast enough to matter. The gap between what the ancient consciousness knew and what the borrowed vessel could do in real time was the central engineering problem of the next 5 weeks. Kale stopped pulling his strikes around day 10, after Adrian told him plainly that reduced contact was not useful to anyone. By day 20, Kale was landing clean hits, and landing them harder, and Adrian was occasionally not being there when they arrived. By day 30, the poem of sparring had begun resolving. The poems were the inner structure of Gruhorn's power, incantations that had encoded into the soul through centuries of witnessed history, each one tied to a specific emotional and martial context. The poem of sparring wasn't a combat technique in the way most knights understood technique. It was a resonance state, a pattern of mana circulation through the heart that sharpened reflex and spatial reading while the verse played behind conscious thought. Reciting it internally while fighting felt, from the outside, like watching someone shift from reacting to anticipating. Kale noticed the change before he could articulate it. The session on day 32 lasted twice as long as usual. On day 35, Kale stopped winning. On day 38, Adrian ended a session by disarming Kale in a single controlled exchange and then walking away without commenting on it, because there wasn't anything worth saying. Count Bale watched day 38 from the courtyard wall. He paid the equipment budget without disputing the result. He also didn't leave. The man who had arrived to collect what he clearly considered a predictable debt stayed through the following week and kept showing up to the training sessions, arms crossed, saying very little. His silence was a different quality from his previous skepticism. Something had been recalibrated in him, quietly, without announcement. The invitation to Lady Arwen Karayan arrived in a sealed envelope that smelled, faintly, of whatever the Iron Lions used to polish their armor. Arwen was the pride of that unit. The Thorny Rose, they called her, one of the youngest triple-chain knights the kingdom had produced in a generation, with a combat record that the capital's noble households mentioned when they needed a reference point for excellence. She wrote, in precise formal language, that she had heard certain claims were circulating about the first prince's recent training outcomes, that such claims were inconsistent with what she understood to be established fact, and that she would welcome the opportunity to clarify the matter through a formal duel at his convenience. The phrasing was polished. The challenge underneath it wasn't. Adrian replied the same afternoon. Brief, direct, no decorative language. He named a date 3 days out and suggested the eastern courtyard. Arwen arrived with an audience she hadn't invited but hadn't discouraged. A collection of Iron Lion officers and enough court observers to make the outcome a matter of institutional record, regardless of what anyone planned. She wore her practice chain instead of war gear but carried it with the ease of someone who had made triple chain feel like ordinary weight. She gave Adrian a look that was professional, appraising, and entirely unconvinced. The first day went to her. Not comfortably. She had expected easier, and her expression when they paused at sunset said she was revising certain internal documents, but cleanly. Adrian's technique was unusual. His footwork drew from patterns she didn't recognize, and his mana reading was peculiarly precise for someone who should have had a broken sensitivity disorder. She won, though. The gap was real. The second day was closer and less comfortable for both of them. Arwen's style was aggressive. The Iron Lions trained for decisive engagement and superior chain output, overwhelming an opponent through cultivated power applied fast. It worked against everyone she had fought. Against Adrian, the poem of sparring had been quietly escalating toward the poem of duel, and that transition brought with it something Arwen's combat experience hadn't prepared her for, the feeling that she was fighting someone who had been in duels longer than her entire martial lineage. Day 3 ended it. She came with everything available, full triple chain output, no conserved reserve, committing to finish what the 2 previous sessions had left unresolved. Adrian let the first exchange run deep, absorbing the rhythm of her full commitment, and then he shifted. The poem of duel completed its verse. His blade found the edge of her guard in a line that shouldn't have existed based on the geometry of the exchange, and it found it 3 times in succession, each pass removing another degree of her structural advantage, until her weapon left her hand on the 4th pass, not violently, but with a finality that made the gathered officers go very quiet. Arwen stood still for a long moment. She looked at the sword on the ground. She looked at Adrian. Then she knelt. She told him that she had come looking for the proof that the rumors were inflated, and she had found instead the opposite. She told him she had no framework for what she had just fought. She asked, kneeling on the stone with complete composure, whether he had any use for a knight who now understood she had spent her whole career preparing for a room she hadn't yet entered. Adrian looked at her for 3 seconds. He said he had use for her. The Iron Lions in the back row, the ones who had arrived expecting to escort their colleague home after a clarifying afternoon, began one by one to look at each other with the expression of people who would need time to process what they'd witnessed. The Noble Club incident came 10 days later and required considerably less artistry. It was a gathering of the capital's minor aristocracy, the younger generation, the sons and nephews of houses with influence enough to be insufferable, but not enough to have real responsibility. Adrian attended for reasons that were strategic rather than social. He had a list. It was not long, but it was specific. The provocation arrived before he'd been in the room 20 minutes. An heir of the Reagan family, emboldened by wine and an audience, made certain observations about the first prince's history, his qualifications, and his mother's lineage. The man had a talent for the precise wording that maximizes damage per syllable, and he deployed it carefully with the assurance of someone who had never personally experienced consequences. Adrian put him on the floor in 4 seconds. This was not technically legal by the event's own gathering customs. It produced a brief silence in which everyone present recalculated their plans for the evening. Then 6 other men decided simultaneously that the situation called for their intervention, presumably out of social solidarity or the mathematics of 6 to 1. By the time the palace guard arrived, 14 members of the aristocracy were waiting to be escorted somewhere secure. Several had discovered they'd spent years cultivating reputations for physical capability that hadn't survived contact with whatever the first prince had become. Adrian stood in the center of the room with a shallow cut along one forearm. Not enough to matter, just enough to indicate the group had made a genuine effort, and watched the guards process the scene with expressions that suggested they hadn't expected tonight's assignment to be this kind of assignment. The 14 were taken into temporary custody. The formal charges were minor and would resolve into fines and record marks. The actual purpose was message delivery, and the message went through. Adelia Byron had been Adrian's personal maid for 3 years, and in that time had learned to make herself functionally invisible in his presence. The original prince had operated on principles that made invisibility the rational survival strategy for anyone under his authority. She performed her duties with the focused efficiency of someone who had concluded that competence and silence were the only reliable defenses available, and she extended no expectations beyond the completion of today's requirements. She was, in Gruhorn's assessment, not what she appeared to be. The system evaluation came during a routine morning. Adrian examining the information the ancient consciousness could access through trait reading, Adelia moving through the room with a tray, completely unaware of being examined. What resolved in the overlay of data stopped Gruhorn mid-thought. Butcher, war maniac, gluttony. 3 traits of the deep combat category, the kind that described not a fighting style, but a fundamental psychological architecture around violence. Dormant, completely sealed, presenting no sign of themselves to outside observation, but present at a density that implied heredity. Agnes Byron, the Sword Marquise, had died 2 generations back, with a reputation for battlefield behavior that the histories described with careful, measured language, and then moved past quickly. Her lineage had gone quiet since then. Adelia was the end of that line, and she was serving tea. Adrian asked her one morning, while she was folding correspondence, what she knew about her family history. She gave the careful, minimized answer of someone who had learned which personal details were safest kept brief. He nodded once, then told her, without preamble, that she was the descendant of Agnes Byron and that she was carrying 3 deep traits in permanent suppression, and asked if she would like to know what those traits actually were. She stood with the folded letter in her hands and said nothing for long enough that he checked her expression to confirm she was still processing rather than having a medical episode. She asked if that was something that could be demonstrated. He spent the better part of the next 2 weeks walking her through the initial stages of the mana heart, a slower, more careful version than his own, adapted for a baseline that was different in its architecture. The traits couldn't be safely unlocked without the structural foundation to hold them. She was, throughout this process, utterly focused and entirely silent, with the quality of concentration that comes from someone who has spent years training themselves to learn whatever was necessary without asking for repetition. The oath came after the heart was established. She asked to offer it. He heard the full terms and accepted them. The soul bond that formed between master and servant with a mana heart foundation was different from standard fealty. It ran beneath words, tied to the circulations of mana at the deepest level either party could access. When it settled, Adelia Byron looked up from her kneel with an expression that was the same as before in all its features and entirely different in its foundation. She was no longer making herself invisible. She was choosing to be calm. The high elf appeared without warning at a royal banquet in the way that things that are very old and very dangerous sometimes choose to appear, at the moment when a room full of people were already distracted by something else, and therefore less positioned to brace themselves. Sigrun of the Mistletoe clan was several thousand years old by the reckoning of anyone still alive to reckon, and she wore it the way some weapons wear their age, not as weight, but as accumulated edge. She drifted through the banquet hall with the unsettling fluid motion of someone who had long since stopped thinking about how bodies moved through space and simply moved, and she found Adrian's location through the crowd with the directness of a needle through cloth. She told the assembled nobility, with the pleasant conversational tone of someone announcing a weather observation, that she had come to see the young prince she had heard certain interesting things about, and that she was pleased to observe that the interesting things appeared to be accurate. She then, in a series of maneuvers that were technically polite and practically inescapable, arranged the terms of a political engagement through the court's established protocols before anyone in the room had fully understood what was being established. The king looked as though he wanted to object and was calculating whether the objection was survivable. Several court ministers were writing notes as a mechanism for not having to react in real time. Adrian sat through this with the stillness of someone doing rapid internal assessment. What Sigrun wanted was proximity, the chance to observe the ancient presence she'd clearly detected and clearly recognized. What she'd arranged was the legal framework to ensure that proximity regardless of his preference. The engagement was political architecture, not sentiment. She made that understood in the comfortable undertone of the conversation, clearly enough for him to hear, and with enough ambiguity that no one else could quote it. He accepted the arrangement. He had already identified 3 different ways it could be disrupted at a later point, none of which required doing anything today. Sigrun caught that. She smiled with genuine appreciation at something that wasn't visible to anyone else in the room, and then moved away to devastate another corner of the gathering. Prince Gillian Leonberger brought an audience to his duel the way a man might bring a portrait painter to a victory, with the confidence of someone who had already decided the primary purpose of the event was documentation. He was the 3rd prince, young and blazingly talented, genuine triple-chain cultivation, at an age when most knights were still working through their 2nd, a prodigy who had spent years receiving the kind of praise that shapes a personality around the assumption of continued correctness. He despised his eldest brother with the clean, uncomplicated contempt of someone who had watched the court's patience erode for years and concluded that contempt was both warranted and socially rewarded. He issued the formal duel request with language that was technically within protocol and emotionally unambiguous. He wanted witnesses. He wanted the outcome entered in the court record. He arrived at the designated time with a crowd that included half the noble houses who had attended the banquet and several who hadn't but had heard about it. Adrian was there when Gillian arrived. He was already standing in position, blade at rest, the way old soldiers stand when they're waiting for something to be over, not tense, not performing, just present. Gillian made a remark before beginning. Several people at the back laughed, carefully. The duel lasted 3 seconds. Adrian moved once. It was a single committed line from entry to decision, not a sequence of exchanges, not a reading period. He came through Gillian's guard along an angle that the 3rd prince's considerable reflexes registered a fraction of a moment too late, and the practice blade struck at the shoulder socket with controlled, precise force. The impact traveled through the joint, disrupted the chain circulation there, and Gillian's output dropped immediately, not injured in any serious sense, but suddenly operating with one arm functionally out of the exchange. That was the end of the exchange. Gillian took the second to recover. He realized, in that second, that he wasn't going to. His mana chains had destabilized from the disruption, his footwork was resetting, and the opponent who had done this was standing at a perfectly measured distance that gave Gillian no angle from which to recover momentum before a second strike could arrive. He tapped his blade to the ground, the formal yield gesture. The crowd at the back didn't laugh this time. The Iron Lions, who had sent several members to observe, later reported to Arwen that the strike had been the cleanest they'd seen at any rank. She told them she was unsurprised and suggested they stop being surprised as a general policy going forward. Count Bale, who had also watched, walked to Adrian afterward and said, in a voice pitched only for his nephew, that whatever he was doing, it was working, and that the North was going to need it. He said this in the way that men who have spent their lives on frontiers say difficult things, flatly, without ceremony, with all the weight in what wasn't elaborated. He said they would be leaving for Winter Castle in a week. The ancient presence behind Adrian's eyes looked north, past the capital's walls, past the civilian plains, to where the Galilee Mountains pressed against the edge of the kingdom's maintained territory, and it felt the particular weight of returning to a place where all things were eventually decided. Old wars, it understood, never completed themselves. They simply rested between the people willing to finish them. The road north shed civilization the way a river sheds its delta, gradually at first, then all at once. The paved imperial roads gave way to compacted gravel, then to packed earth hardened by frost, then to paths that existed primarily because enough men and supply carts had made the same journey enough times that the land had given up resisting. The landscape pressed lower around the route, the hills pulling back as the mountains ahead drew themselves taller, until the Galilee Range occupied the entire northern horizon like a wall someone had built and then abandoned the memory of building. Adrian rode in the supply column rather than a private carriage. Count Bale noticed this on the first morning and said nothing, which was a form of comment. The garrison troops assigned to escort the transfer of command were professional and quietly wary of their new prince passenger. Soldiers develop accurate instincts about the people they're transporting. These ones had served the frontier long enough to know what Winter Castle looked like coming back from, and they spent the first 2 days watching Adrian's eyes without appearing to watch them, checking whether what was inside them matched what the rumors had suggested. By the third day, most of them had stopped watching and started listening when he spoke. He asked questions that weren't the questions a visiting royal usually asked. Not about accommodations or formal arrangements. About terrain. About the seasonal behavior of the passes. About which mountain approaches the orcs favored in winter versus late autumn. About how supplies moved when the high roads iced over. The soldiers answered more fully than they'd intended to, each response pulling a follow-up that was more precise than the last, until one of the sergeants looked at the man he was traveling with and understood, with the quiet certainty of long experience, that this was not a tour of inspection. Count Bale watched these conversations from his horse. His expression over those days moved through several states that he didn't bother concealing, because he was not a man who had practiced concealment. Skepticism had already been revised at the duel. What followed the revision was more complicated. It looked something like a man measuring a situation against a belief he'd held for years, and finding the situation larger. He pulled his horse alongside Adrian's mount on the fourth day and asked, without preamble, where the prince had developed his knowledge of the northern approach corridors. Adrian told him he'd read the campaign histories. Count Bale looked at him for 5 seconds. He said the relevant histories were restricted garrison documents, not palace library holdings. A pause. Adrian said he'd read those too. The Count rode in silence for a while after that. Vincent Valorhard met them at the 3rd garrison checkpoint south of Winter Castle, with the manner of a man who had been told to expect his father and had not been told what else was coming. He was Bale's son, leaner, quicker in his movements, with the particular alertness of a ranger who had been spending years close to things that noticed you back. He commanded the castle's scouting corps, the men who went into the Galilee passes and came back with numbers, and sometimes didn't come back at all. He took one look at Adrian and did not visibly revise his assessment. He gave the formal greeting with professional courtesy and managed to make it feel like a careful transaction, not a welcome. Adrian didn't require a welcome. He asked Vincent for a current count of confirmed orc positions in the lower mountain approach and a map of the last 3 scouting routes. Vincent produced them. He watched the prince study the map with the deliberate stillness of someone waiting to see if this was performance or engagement, and then he answered the follow-up questions with gradually less professional courtesy and gradually more accuracy. By the time they rode the final approach to Winter Castle, they were having an argument about the relative defensibility of 2 ridge positions that was rigorous and precise, and recognizably the argument of 2 people who cared about the same problem. Count Bale rode behind them and showed something that people who knew him well had learned to recognize as satisfaction, though on his face it bore a close resemblance to neutral assessment. Winter Castle had been standing for 2 centuries. It showed the age in honest ways. The stone was darkened, the outer wall worn smooth by decades of northern weather, the towers built with the heavy proportions of a generation that had not been optimistic about what would come at them. It was not beautiful. It was articulate, in the way that things built for a specific purpose and never reassigned developed their own kind of language. Every line of the fortification said the same thing: hold. The garrison numbered 3,000, supplemented by the Silver Fox mercenaries who maintained a separate camp outside the east wall. The troops were capable, seasoned by border service, lean from frontier rationing, accustomed to cold in the way that meant they'd stopped thinking about it as a condition and simply included it in everything. What they lacked was any particular reason to expect the next few months to go well. The orc activity in the Blade Mountains had been intensifying for 8 months. The winter reports from the passes had been getting shorter, because the scouts who went deep enough to gather comprehensive data had not been returning at the same rate as before. The castle's mood was the mood of professionals who understood their situation. Adrian spent his first week learning it. He walked the walls at irregular hours. He attended the morning briefings and said little, watching how the commanders processed information and which details they discarded and which assumptions were so old they'd become invisible. He ate with the Rangers twice and with the regular infantry once, and both times he was quieter than the men expected a royal visitor to be and asked questions they found unexpectedly specific. Vincent kept noticing him at the edges of the castle's operational life and couldn't entirely decide what to do with that noticing. The expedition to the mountain base was Adrian's suggestion and Count Bale's reluctant authorization. A scouting report had placed a medium-sized orc patrol holding a position in the lower pass approach, 20 to 30 combatants, possibly guarding a forward supply cache. Standard procedure was observation and reporting. Adrian proposed something more active. He led 12 rangers and Vincent into the lower approach on a morning when the cloud cover was sitting low over the Galilee ridgelines. The cold at this altitude was different from the castle's cold, thinner and more deliberate, pushing through equipment in ways that required constant adjustment. The patrol was exactly where the scouts had placed them, a dense cluster of heavy-framed figures occupying a natural shelf formation in the rock, with 2 forward sentries posted where the path narrowed. Orc military organization was not the undisciplined chaos that civilian accounts preferred to describe. These ones had positioned themselves with tactical judgment and were maintaining discipline in conditions that would have been genuinely miserable for most combatants. They hit the sentries first, cleanly and without signal to the main group. Then Vincent's rangers came in from the upper angle, while Adrian took the front of the shelf directly. Gruhorn's memory held an accurate record of how orcs fought. The specific weight distribution, the preference for committed overhand strikes, the tendency to read spatial distance using the shoulder rather than the eyes. An orc's reach was a weapon in itself, and an opponent who didn't account for it in the entry distance paid for the oversight in the first 2 seconds of any exchange. Adrian accounted for it. He came in below the first heavy swing and drove through the gap it opened, and the ancient blade patterns that had been developed in wars that predated this kingdom handled the rest. The rangers at his flanks had enough space to work because the center of the shelf stayed occupied in ways that kept the orc formation from closing on them. The noble orc came at the end of it, recognizable by the weight of his armor and the different quality of his movement, the combat training visible in how he managed his center of gravity through the chaos of the ongoing fight. He locked onto Adrian and came straight at the source of his problem, which was the decision Gruhorn had expected and prepared for. The engagement was genuine. The noble was fast, technically skilled, and carrying personal power that the regular patrol members hadn't approached. He carved through 2 changes of direction and nearly found Adrian's flank on the 3rd before the poem of revenge completed its first verse inside the mana heart. Grief was its fuel. Not abstract grief, specific, named grief. The scouts in the scouting reports who hadn't come back, cataloged in detail over a week of morning briefings, held in memory as named individuals rather than statistical loss. The poem built from that material, and it burned differently than the duel poem. More committed, less elegant. It became the poem of requiem when it found its shape, and when Adrian drove his blade through the noble's guard in the final pass, the release of energy through the heart scattered frost from the surrounding rock in a visible radius. He stood over the orc noble in the aftermath. He took the banner, the military standard the noble had been carrying, which among orc forces functioned as a record of authority and conquest. He pulled it from the frozen ground and tucked it under his arm. The 12 rangers watched this from the surrounding shelf. A ranger named Quentus, who had been fighting the Galilee approaches for 6 years and maintained the characteristic emotional expressiveness of someone who had learned that showing surprise was inefficient, looked at the prince standing in the middle of the cleared shelf holding an orc noble's banner and said, quietly, to no one in particular, that he had not expected today to end like this. 3 others made sounds of agreement. Vincent was already counting the bodies with the systematic efficiency of a man who maintained a running tally of kills and always verified the numbers himself. He reached his count, confirmed it against the visual evidence, and then looked at the banner under Adrian's arm with an expression that was specifically the expression of a man whose multi-year personal record had just become relevant in a way he hadn't anticipated. He asked casually how many banners the prince was planning to collect. Adrian considered the question. He said as many as were available. Vincent looked at the banner again. He made no further comment, but a competitive calculation had visibly begun somewhere behind his eyes. The Orc vanguard arrived 12 days later. Not a patrol, a genuine advance element, 300 strong, pushing down the widest approach corridor with a directness that indicated they were measuring resistance rather than raiding. They held the base of the approach and sent an advance unit to the edge of effective bow range from the castle walls, which was an announcement more than an attack. Count Bale watched from the east tower. He said it was starting. Adrian was already at the wall when the advance unit arrived. He had been there for 20 minutes. The Orc force at the vanguard's leading edge included a combat officer, visually distinct, the way high-ranked Orc combatants marked themselves, and holding a position at the column's front that established his authority over the approach without requiring verbal communication. He looked at the castle wall. He looked at the people on it. He stopped at Adrian with the instinctual assessment that one combat entity gives another when both parties recognize what they're observing. He called a challenge. The form of it was specific, a single combat request, delivered in the hybrid trading language that the border regions had developed across decades of grudging necessity. Count Bale said the castle didn't accept single combat challenges from forward elements. It was an invitation to appear weak regardless of outcome. Adrian was already moving toward the gate. The argument between them lasted approximately 40 seconds, at the end of which Count Bale made a sound that contained very old frustration, and followed his nephew out of the gate with the resigned authority of a man who had decided that if this was happening, he was at least going to be close to it. The Orc officer was larger than the noble on the mountain shelf, more powerful in the raw physical sense, with the kind of bone structure that implied a lineage specifically shaped by combat over generations. He watched Adrian cross the open ground between the gate and his position, and apparently found what he was observing acceptable because he waited with professional patience. The exchange was harder than the shelf had been. The Orc commander had no tactical surprises, but his physical output was substantial enough that the poem of duel required full engagement to track it, complete investment of the mana heart, every circulation aligned, the rhythm of the verse matching the rhythm of the fight. Adrian took a graze along his left forearm in the second exchange and felt the numbness from the impact run to his elbow and back. The Requiem poem had expanded the base of available mana, but the commander's chain-equivalent power was genuinely high-tier, and working against it left Adrian's output fully committed with nothing held in reserve. He won in the fifth exchange. The angle was narrow, a pivot off the Orc's committed follow-through that required precise footwork on frozen ground where 1 degree of error would have closed the opportunity. The blade found the gap between the commander's pauldron and neck plate and applied enough force to collapse the connection. The fall was decisive. Adrian pulled the second banner. He turned back toward the gate. Behind him, the Orc vanguard was still, not retreating, watching. 300 combatants observing the math of what had just occurred and adjusting internal calculations accordingly. Adrian had made it halfway back to the gate when the first sound reached them, not from the vanguard, from the direction of the Blade Mountains themselves. It was a low sound, not quite percussion, not quite ground movement, but something between them that the castle's stone walls picked up as a vibration before anyone processed it as audio. The veterans on the wall went still with the automatic response of people who had learned that unfamiliar sounds in the northern approach deserved immediate classification. Then the sky above the eastern ridgeline moved. It was visible at distance before its trajectory resolved, a mass, dark against the pale cloud cover, moving with a velocity that no ballistic equipment the kingdom possessed could have achieved. The mana signature hit Adrian's heart sense like a wall, ancient, colossal, contemptuous of the concept of range as a limiting factor. He ran. The impact came before he cleared the gate, the earth shuddering, not the sharp concussion of standard siege impact, but the slower, deeper resonance of something enormous meeting solid rock at the end of a very long flight. The explosion of stone and earth caught him in the periphery and threw him forward, and he hit the ground inside the gate with debris raining on the stone around him, and he lay still for a moment taking stock of his own condition, while the ringing in his ears declined from acute to bearable. He got to his knees. He looked back through the gate. The shaft he'd seen in the cold open was exactly where it had struck, jutting from the mountain rock 40 paces east of where he'd been standing, black iron wider than his torso, still settling from the kinetic energy of its delivery. It had not been aimed to kill him. The trajectory and impact point were too precise for a near miss to be accidental. It had been aimed to land where it landed. 40 paces, a statement of margin, a demonstration that the distance could have been corrected. Count Bale reached him and grabbed his arm to pull him upright. He asked if his nephew was alive in the flat voice people use when they're asking a question they are very afraid of the answer to. Adrian said he was alive. Bale looked at the shaft in the mountain. He looked at the direction it had come from, the far side of the Galilee Range, miles of rock and altitude between here and whatever had thrown it. He was a quad-chain knight who had spent 30 years on the northern frontier and had personally measured the limits of what exceptional human power could accomplish. He said quietly that they would need to have a very honest conversation about what they were actually defending against. Adrian agreed. He was already having that conversation internally, and the preliminary conclusions were not comfortable. The vanguard, he noted, had retreated during the impact. They were gone from the approach corridor, pulled back without apparent order, as if whatever had thrown the spear had signaled a withdrawal through means that didn't require shouted commands. The forward measurement was done. The report had been taken. The castle gate was closed. The walls were manned. On the garrison battlements, several hundred soldiers who had just watched an iron shaft the size of a young tree arrive across a mountain range stood in the kind of silence that forms when experienced people realize they need to revise their understanding of what the word threat contains. Adrian walked to the command hall. He wanted the maps, the whole set, every survey of the Blade Mountain interior the garrison had accumulated over 30 years, every scouting report that had come back from the deep passes, every recorded estimate of orc population density in the range. What was coming was not a border raid. It had announced itself, and the announcement had been measured and intentional and deeply familiar to the ancient mind that had seen such announcements before, across centuries that preceded this kingdom's founding. The orc warlord existed. He had looked across his mountains and found something at Winter Castle worth addressing personally. Gruhorn understood what that meant in ways that Adrian's borrowed face didn't fully show. Somewhere in the deep memory of the entity that had seen civilizations open and close, a specific calibration was occurring, the one that happened when a conflict stopped being about border management and started being about whether the border would continue to exist. The maps were spread across the command table. Count Bale stood across from him. Vincent leaned in the doorway with the quiet intensity of a man recalibrating everything he thought he knew about the next year of his life. Outside, the Galilee Mountains were silent in the way that things making very large preparations tend to be silent. That night, Count Bale didn't sleep. Adrian found him in the courtyard at the 3rd hour past midnight, standing in the cold without a coat, running through sword forms that his body knew well enough to produce without conscious direction. The forms were standard double-chain progression, the curriculum every knight of his generation had drilled past the point of thought. But the way he was running them had changed. He was pushing mana through the sequences differently, feeling for something at the edge of what his chains could carry, the way a man tests ice before committing his weight. Adrian watched from the archway without announcing himself. Count Bale had been a quad-chain knight for 11 years. The plateau at that level was well documented. The final chain was the hardest by an order of magnitude, requiring a quality of cultivation that most quad-chain knights never developed, and the gap between quad-chain and penta-chain was less a step than a cliff. The penta realm had fewer than a dozen confirmed living practitioners in the entire kingdom. Most senior knights reached quad and understood, eventually, that this was where they would remain. But Count Bale had spent the last 8 hours sitting with the memory of what he'd watched on the mountainside and at the base of the castle gate. The mana poetry flowing through a mana heart instead of chains, incantations built from grief and fury channeling power that his own quad-chain output hadn't been able to produce with equivalent effort. He had seen, in practical combat terms, something he'd dismissed as inferior technique outperform what he'd spent a lifetime refining. The mana heart, Gruhorn understood, could not make Bale reach pentachain directly, but the heart's specific resonance capacity, its ability to synchronize mana rhythms across users, the core feature that made the war hymns possible, could show a quad-chain cultivator something about the quality of their own flow that years of isolated chain refinement had obscured. Adrian stepped into the courtyard. He said, without preamble, that there was a concept his uncle might find worth examining. Not the monoheart method, but the monoheart's principle of emotional resonance feeding directly into output. Bale stopped his forms. He turned. He looked at his nephew the way a general looks at intelligence that arrives from an unexpected source, not credulous, not dismissive, but actively measuring. He said, "Show me." They stood in the cold for 2 more hours. Adrian spoke in the dry shorthand of someone translating complex internal knowledge into language a different system could use. Not the full structure of the ancient poems, but the underlying principle, that mana output was amplified by the quality of its emotional origin, and that the chains, which most knights treated as neutral conduits, could carry that amplification if the practitioner learned to distinguish between mana that was merely flowing and mana that was moving with genuine purpose behind it. Bale tried it first mechanically, the way careful men approach unfamiliar ground, and got nothing. He tried it again with the morning's events sitting at the front of his mind, the spear shaft in the mountain rock, the size of it, the quiet statement of what it implied about what was coming for Winter Castle, and something in his chain circulation shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly, but Adrian's heart sense picked up the change as a change in frequency, a small lock finding its position, a beginning. The Night Slayer arrived 9 days later, and it arrived at night, which was not a coincidence. The mutation commanders that the Orc military produced from its deep past breeding programs were rare and specific instruments. They were not battlefield leaders. They were designed for penetration, moving through defensive perimeters, creating breaches that conventional assault forces could then exploit, neutralizing command elements before an engagement formally began. The Night Slayer had earned its designation through 2 previous documented encounters with border garrisons, neither of which had ended well for the garrison. Its distinctive trait was the mind's eye, a sensory capacity that allowed it to perceive mana signatures at range with precision that exceeded even trained human cultivators. It read defenses the way a cartographer reads terrain, systematically, accurately, with a clear sense of what the gaps meant in practical terms. The castle's watch rotation changed every 3 hours. Between the hour of the second bell and the third, the north parapet ran with a crew that included 2 younger soldiers who hadn't yet fully calibrated their night reading of the approaches. The Night Slayer had assessed this in the preceding 4 days, sitting at the edge of its own visibility range in the mountain shadow, counting breaths and timing intervals. It came over the north wall at the gap in the second bell watch with 24 specialized units at its back. The first alarm reached Adrian while he was reviewing scouting report summaries. He was moving toward the courtyard before the second alarm sounded, Adelia 3 steps behind him, with a quietness of motion that her service background provided and her current mana state used for a different purpose. They hit the outer engagement at the north corridor, a knot of specialized orc units that were already past the first interior checkpoint and moving with purpose toward the garrison command structure. Adrian took the front of the corridor. The combat was close quarters and immediate, the kind of fighting where the poetry that built power from distance and rhythm had to be adapted to the compressed geometry of walls and doorways. He managed it. The Requiem poems expanded access held through the corridor fighting, and he worked through the advance units methodically while listening for the signature he'd been told to expect. The different quality of the mind's eye trait, perceptible as a specific type of mana read pressure from a direction that moved. The Night Slayer found him first. It was larger than the advance units, differently proportioned, the mutation breeding visible in the asymmetry of its build, the left side heavier than the right in a way that modified its center of gravity into something non-standard. It had already identified Adrian as the primary threat by the time he located it by signature, and it came through the corridor wall rather than around the corner, which meant it had assessed the wall's structural tolerance while he was still calculating approach angles. The impact from the wall section hitting him threw Adrian sideways. He got his footing back against the opposite wall and took the Night Slayer's first committed strike on a deflection that cost him lateral movement he didn't recover fully. The mind's eye wasn't a combat trait in the conventional sense. It didn't make the creature faster or stronger in isolation. It made the creature accurate in the specific way that was most dangerous in a corridor. It read where Adrian's weight was before his weight fully committed, and used that fraction of a second to position its own center. 3 exchanges. The Night Slayer was winning 2 of them. Adelia was 6 feet back in the corridor, watching. Gruhorn's assessment of the situation ran fast and landed on the same conclusion it had been building toward since the courtyard 2 weeks ago. The fight in this corridor, at this moment, required something Adrian's current poem access couldn't resolve cleanly without risk. The gap was real. The Night Slayer's trait was precisely calibrated to close it. He turned, briefly, and looked at Adelia. He said one word, her name. What happened in the next 3 seconds would be described differently by the 2 soldiers who witnessed it from the corridor end. They agreed on the surface facts. The maid standing 6 feet back underwent a change that was faster than voluntary movement could explain. Her posture dropped, her mana signature spiked through a range that should not have been accessible to her cultivation level, and she covered the 6 feet to the Night Slayer's left flank in a way that was not running and was not quite anything else they had a word for. The butcher trait had been dormant for years, held under the careful, deliberate structure of a woman who had built her entire daily existence around not being dangerous. When the smell of her master's blood reached it, the structure that was holding it simply stopped being relevant. The trait did not emerge gradually. It arrived, full and specific, with the ancestral shape of Agnes Byron's battlefield architecture underneath it. What the Night Slayer's mind's eye read from her in the split second it reallocated attention was not a maid. It was a pattern it did not have reference data for, moving in ways that its experience-based prediction models had no template to anticipate. It did not survive the recalibration window. Adelia worked through the Night Slayer and the remaining specialized units in the corridor with the focused intensity of a very specific instrument being used for its intended purpose. She moved without sound, except for the sounds of contact, and she did not stop moving until there was nothing left in the corridor that was still attempting to function. Then she stopped. She stood in the middle of the corridor wreckage, and the butcher trait receded the way floodwater recedes. Not instantly, not completely, but enough that her breathing normalized, and the specific quality of her focus changed from something ancient and instinctual back to something that had her master's location as its primary coordinate. She turned to Adrian. She asked, in her ordinary voice, if he was injured. He told her the forearm graze from the initial impact was manageable. She nodded. She checked his arm herself anyway. She had blood on her uniform that wasn't hers, and she appeared not to have noticed. Adrian looked at what she'd done to the corridor. The War Maniac trait had expressed alongside the Butcher. He'd seen the signature shift. Gluttony had begun its own preliminary activation before she'd finished, which meant the next engagement would start at a higher baseline. The ancestral soul that had spent centuries in the company of extraordinary warriors knew what it was looking at. Agnes Byron's legacy had not diminished across generations. It had simply been waiting for conditions that allowed it to be received rather than suppressed. The garrison had watched the corridor fight's aftermath. Not all of them. The engagement had been interior, and most of the 3,000 soldiers had only heard the sounds. But enough had seen enough that the account moved through the castle with the speed that accounts of unusual things always moved through closed fortifications. What they heard, and what was accurate, the prince had baited the Night Slayer into a prepared engagement zone. His companion had ended the specialist commander, and the breach was being resealed. What Adrian recognized in the following morning's briefing was that the account had changed something in the garrison's atmosphere. A subtle shift from professional endurance towards something with more forward momentum. The soldiers who had been watching him since his arrival with the appraising patience of people who needed to know whether the royal visitor was going to be an asset or a liability had arrived at their conclusion. He used the shift. The poem of winter. He had been building toward it since the mountain shelf, accumulating the mana heart capacity that a large resonance loop required. The concept was not new to the ancient soul. In the founding wars, the great battle hymns had been sung by entire armies, the individual voices less important than the collective synchronization. The center holder's heart core serving as the anchor through which thousands of individual mana ring outputs were harmonized into a unified release. But it had never been attempted with modern chain knights, whose rings were structurally different from the ancient cultivation methods and had never been tested for resonance compatibility with a monoheart anchor. He spent 3 days explaining the concept to the garrison's senior officers. Most of them heard it with the reasonable skepticism of people being asked to attempt something that had no precedent in their training. Count Bale heard it and was quiet for a long time, and then he said that if what he'd felt in the courtyard 2 weeks ago was any indication of what partial resonance felt like, he was willing to attempt full synchronization. The night they chose was clear and cold, the Galilee Range visible in the darkness as a mass of shadow against the lesser dark of the northern sky. The garrison assembled on the castle walls and in the courtyard, not in full war formation, not yet, but in the distributed positioning that the resonance geometry required. 3,000 soldiers, most of them chain knights of varying rank, each one holding their chains at a light circulation rate on Adrian's instruction. He stood at the center of the courtyard. He put his mana heart into the full Four Seasons poem, the winter verse, specifically, which had been building since the first morning frost on the mountain shelf when the Requiem poem found its seasonal shape. The heart core expanded through the circulation, and he opened the synchronization channel. The resonance loop was imperfect. It was always going to be imperfect on the first attempt, with cultivators who had never felt anything like it before and were maintaining their own rings in isolation. But imperfect synchronization with 3,000 chain outputs feeding through a mana heart anchor was still, in raw terms, a staggering quantity of collective force. The Four Seasons poem of winter completed its verse through the loop at the third attempt. The release was visible. The air above the castle changed quality, a compression and then an expansion that the soldiers in the formation felt not as external pressure, but as something that moved through their own mana chains from outside and then returned amplified. The orc observers in the mountain shadow registered it. 2 scouts who had been watching the castle from the forward ridgeline retreated before the loop fully completed, which meant the mana signature at range was readable as something that exceeded normal garrison capacity. Good. Adrian wanted it readable. The garrison, afterward, stood in the courtyard and on the walls with the particular silence of people who have experienced something outside their existing categories. Then a sound began at the back of the formation. Not organized, not a cheer exactly, more the sound of released pressure from a group of people who had been holding a great deal of compressed uncertainty and had found, briefly, something to push it through. Count Bale stood at the courtyard edge. His face held the expression of a man who had spent 30 years on this frontier and had believed, professionally and completely, that he had correctly understood the limits of what was possible here. He looked at his nephew for a long moment. He said nothing, but he crossed his fist over his chest, the garrison salute, and held it. The Silver Fox Mercenaries were the most experienced private military company operating in the Northern Territories, and their commander, a scarred woman named Irast, had the commercial instincts of someone who had survived 20 years of frontier contracts by being extremely accurate about which commitments were worth making. She had heard about the war hymn. She had sent a message requesting a meeting within 48 hours of hearing about it. She arrived with 3 of her senior officers and sat across from Adrian in the garrison hall with the relaxed posture of someone who had already made up her mind and was attending the meeting to confirm the arithmetic. She asked what terms he was offering. He said 20 years of guaranteed contract, garrison provisions included, with a tiered bonus structure based on confirmed engagement results. He said the terms were fixed and not open to counter-negotiation because he was not actually selling services. He was building a force structure, and the Silver Fox were either going to be part of it under these terms or they weren't. Irast studied him. She asked why she would commit 20 years to a contract with a prince who, according to every record she'd checked, was not in the line of succession with any realistic claim on long-term authority. He told her that the records she'd checked were 3 months old, and that she should re-examine her assessment of his claim on authority against the evidence of the past 3 months, rather than the records that preceded it. He also told her that the North was going to need a mercenary force that understood mountain fighting, and that the only alternative to being part of the structure he was building was operating outside it, which in the coming months was going to become increasingly uncomfortable. Irast looked at her 3 senior officers. One of them had been at the wall during the war hymn. He gave her a small nod. She signed the contract that afternoon. The mountain hunts came at Vincent's suggestion and Adrian's enthusiastic agreement. The reasoning was tactical, reducing orc presence in the lower and middle approach corridors, denying forward positioning, accumulating intelligence about the Blade Mountain interior through direct contact. The practical effect was 3 weeks of sustained operations in terrain that the garrison's best rangers knew well and the orc patrols knew better. Adrian took 12-man teams. He alternated the ranger composition so that over the course of the 3 weeks, a substantial percentage of Winter Castle's active scout corps had operated under his direct command in live contact conditions. He was systematic about this in a way that the Rangers gradually recognized as deliberate, each team returning with more than orc kills, returning with specific competencies developed in specific terrain types, returning with the kind of combat experience under real conditions that training exercises couldn't replicate. The banner count passed 47. Vincent's multi-year personal record fell on the 22nd day, and Vincent's reaction was the expression of a man who was genuinely unhappy about a thing he genuinely respected, which is a specific and recognizable expression that Adrian noted without commenting on. The ogre came on the 6th expedition. It occupied a narrow canyon 3 hours into the mountain interior, one of the large-bodied high-tier monsters that the Blade Mountains generated from something in their specific ecosystem. An enormous and not particularly intelligent creature with a physical power output that made conventional engagement methods unreliable. The Rangers marked it as a standard avoidance target and waited for Adrian's decision. He went in. The canyon geometry was useful. It negated the ogre's mobility advantage and compressed the engagement into a channel that Adrian could control with his own positioning. The fight was not elegant. The ogre's strikes required complete evasion rather than deflection, because deflection at that force differential simply transferred the impact. He spent most of the engagement moving laterally and forward, rather than engaging directly, looking for the structural angle that the creature's own momentum would open. It opened twice. He used both times. In the aftermath, standing at the canyon floor with the team, Adelia showed the first expression of genuine exhaustion he'd seen from her since the corridor. She had managed 2 of the trolls that the ogre's passage had displaced into the approach path. Direct, efficient, clean kills. But the War Maniac trait had expressed more fully during the second one, and the post-engagement recalibration was costing her effort. A new trait resolved in the evaluation window during that recalibration, the Poem of the Raven, encoded through the specific sequence of the hunt: stealth, patience, a strike from an angle the target never found its defense against. The ancient soul recognized the verse. It was a different quality from the Requiem and the Duel poems, quieter, more premeditated, the power drawn from accumulated observation rather than emotional intensity. Adelia's trait unlocked alongside it. The Gluttony trait, finally fully expressed through the canyon combat, had begun the cycle the other 2 traits required to operate at their full capacity. The ancestral architecture of Agnes Byron was now functioning as designed rather than suppressed. She looked at her hands in the canyon floor's cold light. She closed them. She said quietly that she felt different. Adrian told her that was accurate. The orc warlord moved his main force in the last week of the month, 20,000. The number arrived through 2 separate scouting reports on the same morning, both delivered by Rangers who had made emergency speed back from observation points, and both showing the specific facial expression of men who had gone into the mountains expecting normal patrol activity and had come back having seen something that reclassified the situation entirely. Adrian read both reports at the command table. He set them down. He looked at the map. Count Bale arrived in the command hall 12 minutes later and read the same reports over the same map with the silence of a man who had spent 30 years building internal frameworks for threat assessment and was currently calculating whether those frameworks were correctly scaled. 20,000 orcs was not a border enforcement action. It was not a punitive raid. It was not territorial expansion of the kind the northern frontier had historically managed. An orc force of that size, moving with the organizational coherence that the scouting reports described, pre-positioned supply caches, specialist units at the advance, the warlord's banner confirmed at the column's center, was a campaign. The fortress had 3,000 defenders, supplemented by the Silver Fox and a reserve of 200 rangers. The surrounding northern lords held private garrisons totaling approximately 8,000 soldiers at various distances from Winter Castle. The kingdom's central military, which maintained the 1st and 2nd Legions in the South and Midlands, was 3 weeks of hard march away. Adrian sent the first request for reinforcement on the morning the reports arrived. He drafted it himself. Direct, specific, with the orc force numbers and the timeline attached, the defensive capacity of the fortress clearly stated, and the strategic consequence of a breach through Winter Castle laid out in terms that required no elaboration. He sent copies to Count Garan of the Northern Inland Territory, Count Hein of the Midland Garrison, and the Royal Court's Military Ministry. He sent it without expecting a specific outcome. the ancient soul had operated through enough campaigns to understand that requests sent to parties with competing interests were not communications so much as records. He began preparing the second defensive line. The mercenaries' route scouting, which he had assigned as what seemed like a precautionary task 3 weeks earlier, was actually the preparation for this specific contingency. Erast confirmed, when he asked, that the 3 emergency retreat corridors had been fully assessed, provisioned at midpoints, and were accessible in any weather condition the northern winter could produce. She said this with the expression of someone who had been wondering when the actual purpose of the assignment was going to be stated. He told the garrison's senior officers that they were preparing for a siege of undetermined duration, that reinforcement from the mainland was being requested and should not be expected, and that the operational assumption from this point forward was that the castle would hold from its own resources. He said this plainly, without softening it or elaborating it, because the men in that room were professionals who deserved accurate information and would prepare better with accurate information than with managed expectations. The preparations ran with the urgency of a force that had been told the truth. Supply inventory was completed and rationing schedules were set. Wall positions were manned at double rotation. The resonance loop was rehearsed until the synchronization rate improved significantly from the first session. Vincent's rangers pre-positioned themselves at the 3 observation points that would give the earliest warning of the main column's approach. The second reinforcement request went 4 days after the first. Count Gurin responded that his garrison was committed to domestic security requirements and could not be redeployed without formal crown order. Count Hein's response was slower and considerably more creative in its presentation of legal obstacles. The third request went 6 days later. No response. The 4th, 7th, and 10th requests documented the deteriorating situation with the systematic specificity of a man building a record for purposes other than communication. Adrian wrote each one himself and logged each dispatch with 2 witnesses. He said to Vincent, while the 12th request was being sealed, that records were the most patient form of weapons available to the wronged, and that patience was something he had in excess. Vincent asked, while applying the garrison seal to the dispatch, what he meant by that. Adrian said he meant that the lords withholding their forces were building a case for someone who intended to settle it, and that the record was the foundation of the settlement. Vincent was quiet for a while after that. He said his father had sent similar requests 5 years earlier during a smaller incursion and had received similar responses. He said it was the specific helplessness of watching men with the capacity to act choose not to, for reasons that had nothing to do with the people dying in the interim. Adrian looked at the sealed dispatch in his hand. He said that the difference between then and now was him, and that he wanted Vincent to remember that distinction carefully. He meant it precisely, not as comfort, as a statement of intended outcome. The Orc warlord arrived at the mountain pass exits on the 14th day of the month. He did not immediately assault. He arranged his 20,000 in the broad corridor below the castle approach and let Winter Castle see them, a deliberate display of scale, the force positioned in full visibility during daylight hours, the warlord's banner visible at the center of the formation. It was the same logic as the spear throw, a demonstration of what was being brought against this place, offered as information, with the implicit question of whether the castle intended to make a decision based on that information. No white flag was raised at Winter Castle. The warlord waited until the following dawn, which the defenders used to confirm their positions, check their supply status, and sleep in the rotation the duty schedule allowed. Adrian spent the first watch personally walking the wall. He stopped at the north parapet for 10 minutes and looked at the dark mass of the Orc encampment in the valley below, the fires marking the individual unit positions like a second map of stars inverted against the ground. He had fought battles of this scale, in the memory that predated this body by centuries. He understood siege mathematics in the cold way that the ancient consciousness held all tactical knowledge, as variables rather than abstractions, each one with a value that could be calculated if you knew what to measure. The mathematics here were not favorable. They had never been intended to be favorable. The fortress was the choke point, not the solution. The solution required forces that were currently sitting behind walls in the properties of men who had decided that their private interests could be separated from the kingdom's collective survival. He looked at the fires. He stayed until the cold pushed through even the heavy coat he'd borrowed from the garrison stores. And then he walked back to the command hall and slept 3 hours on the camp cot that someone had moved into the corner of the room, 3 days after his arrival, in the considerate way that garrison staffs make small adjustments without being asked. The siege began at dawn with the sound of drums. The drums ran without pause for 3 hours before the first wave broke against the outer wall. It was not disorganized. That was the first thing the garrison understood, and understanding it cost some of them the specific composure that came from believing the enemy's scale would be offset by its lack of discipline. The orc military that pressed against Winter Castle's walls on the first morning moved in unit formations that maintained their structure under arrow fire, rotated their assault columns with a timing that suggested rehearsal, and pulled back from failed pushes before casualties reached levels that would have compromised future engagement capacity. They were not spending their soldiers carelessly. They were measuring the wall. Adrian was at the south gate tower through the first assault and on the east parapet through the second. He moved between positions not randomly, but following the pattern of the orc probing. Wherever their pressure seemed to be reading something, he wanted to be present to understand what they were reading and whether his interpretation of that reading matched theirs. By day 3, he had a clear picture of their tactical priority list and had redistributed the wall rotation to compress their projected points of maximum pressure into corridors that could be reinforced from the inner reserves without depleting the positions on either side. Count Bale ran the south wall. He was in contact for 17 hours of the first day and looked, at the end of it, exactly as tired as a man who had been fighting for 17 hours looks. He also looked, in the specific way that men who have been waiting their whole career for a war of genuine scale look, alive in a way that had not been visible in him in the capital. Vincent's Rangers occupied the castle interior and the secondary walls, managing the movement of supplies and rotating the injured out of frontline positions with the efficiency of people who had done this work under previous pressures and were now doing it under higher ones. He ran 4 hours of sleep per cycle and did not complain about it, which was the Ranger way of indicating that complaint was not a productive use of the available energy. Adelia was at Adrian's left shoulder through every wall engagement. The Butcher trait had stabilized into a controlled expression after the Night Slayer corridor. It activated cleanly when needed and receded completely when the immediate threat was neutralized, the Mana Heart structure holding the channel open and manageable rather than volatile. She fought with the contained precision of someone who had made peace with what she was, and could now choose how to use it rather than spending energy resisting it. The days accumulated. Each one followed the same shape: dawn assault, midday pressure, evening probe, night harassment. The orc force was systematic in a way that was more exhausting than a single catastrophic assault would have been, because a catastrophic assault could be survived and then rested from. This was continuous. It did not give the garrison the psychological relief of a defined engagement and resolution. It simply continued, applying pressure at every point that pressure could be applied, reading each response for information, and using that information for the following morning's distribution. By day 6, the garrison's sleep deficit was visible. The rotation was holding. Adrian had designed it with redundancy, but holding a rotation and maintaining full combat effectiveness within that rotation were different things, and the gap between them was growing. On day 8, the requests that had gone unanswered were still unanswered. Adrian did not send another. The record was complete. Everything after this point would be settled in a different register. The scout who died on day 9 was named Forel. He was 23 years old, had been assigned to Vincent's Corps 2 years earlier, and had, according to the veterans in his unit, an extraordinary ability to move through the mountain approaches in near-total darkness, something they attributed to upbringing in a border village where night visibility was a practical survival skill rather than a cultivated trait. He was sent outside the walls at the third bell to confirm the status of the northeastern approach, which had been quiet for longer than the pattern suggested it should be. He confirmed the approach. On the return, he encountered a wolf pack that the orc advance had displaced from its mountain territory, driven down into the corridor by the disruption of their normal range. He was outnumbered significantly. He held the wolves at the base of the path long enough for 2 other scouts behind him to reach the wall safely, and then he did not reach it himself. The scouts he'd covered came back and reported this with the controlled efficiency of professionals delivering actionable information. And then one of them went to the corner of the garrison hall and sat facing the wall for 10 minutes, and nobody said anything about it. Adrian wrote Forel's name in the garrison record that night. He wrote it in the section he'd created at the start of the siege. Not the casualty list, which was formal and formatted, but a separate accounting kept in his own handwriting in a small notebook he'd taken from the command hall supplies. The distinction mattered to him, and the ancient soul didn't examine the feeling too carefully because it was accurate and the accuracy was the point. On the morning of day 12, Count Bale came to him before the dawn formation. He sat across from Adrian at the command table, the man who had arrived in the capital loudly 3 months ago, who had dismantled his nephew's self-assessment with the bluntness of a frontier veteran and been revised by what he found. He sat with the stillness of a man who had finished a calculation and was delivering its result. He said that the orc force was not going to exhaust itself against the walls. He said the supply chains the orcs had pre-positioned in the mountain were sufficient for another 3 weeks at minimum, and that the castle's food reserves, at current consumption with current garrison size, would begin failing before that point. He said the resonance loop could sustain pressure from the walls, but could not permanently deny an enemy with this level of numerical advantage and this level of patience. He said they had 4 days before the balance shifted past recoverable. Adrian already knew this. He had known it since day 9. He had been waiting for Bale to arrive at the same number independently, because he needed the conversation to be between two people who had done the calculation separately and reached the same place, not a commander accepting a subordinate's assessment. He said they needed to break the warlord's command structure directly. Bale was quiet. He said that the warlord's position in the orc formation was at the center of the main encampment, which placed it approximately 400 meters beyond the point where a cavalry force could penetrate on momentum alone before the surrounding units closed the corridor. Adrian said they didn't need to survive the full penetration. They needed to reach the warlord, disrupt his command presence sufficiently to collapse the assault coherence, and create the window for the castle remnants to execute the retreat along the pre-planned corridor. Bale looked at him for a long time. He said that what his nephew was describing was a charge from which the cavalry force would not return. Adrian said he was aware of that. The Count was quiet again. Then he said that he had been on this frontier for 30 years, and had watched it held by men who understood that the northern wall was the price the southern kingdoms paid in other people's lives, and that he had made his peace with what this place cost, because he believed the cost was necessary. He said he had not made his peace with the idea of his nephew dying in a cavalry charge at the center of 20,000 orcs. Adrian told him he had no intention of dying. He said it with the calm certainty of someone making a tactical statement rather than a reassurance. Count Bale looked at his nephew across the campaign table, at the maps and the dispatch logs and the casualty notebook, and the expression on his face was one that Adrian had not seen from him before. Not the skepticism of the courtyard, not the revised assessment of the training ground. Something beneath both of those, something from the level where veteran soldiers keep the things they don't discuss in operational language. He said that he had always thought his sister's boy was a disaster the kingdom would spend a generation recovering from. He said he'd been wrong about enough things in the past 3 months that he'd stopped trusting his initial assessments. He said he was proud. He said it the way frontier men say difficult things. Flatly, looking at the map rather than at the person, with the weight carried in the understatement rather than the words. They went out at dawn on the 14th day, 300 cavalry. The Silver Fox supplied 60 of them, and Irast rode at the left column with the expression of someone who had read the contract terms carefully enough to know this contingency had been within the mathematical range of possibilities. The garrison's heavy cavalry formed the right column. Adrian rode at the center, with Adelia flanking him on a borrowed horse she handled with the focused competence she applied to everything she did. Count Bale rode directly behind his nephew. He had said nothing further about the plan since the command table. He had attended the preparation meeting, confirmed the retreat corridor assignments with Vincent, and spent the hour before departure sharpening his sword with the slow, deliberate attention of a man performing an act of private significance. The orc encampment had been reading the castle's daily patterns for 14 days. A cavalry sortie at dawn was not outside its calculation. The formation began responding before the column reached full speed. Adrian drove the Requiem poem to full output from the first stride. The resonance loop was not available in open field. It required the garrison formation's collective positioning, and the garrison was currently holding the walls. What he had was the heart, the full accumulated capacity of 3 months of escalating cultivation, the emotional material of 14 days of siege burning through the circulation, and the blade that had been present at the founding of the kingdom, it was now riding to defend. The initial contact shattered the first orc defensive line cleanly. The cavalry's combined impact with the Requiem output created a breach that the column drove through before the response units could close it, and they were deep into the camp's second tier before the full weight of the counter-response organized. That was where the mathematics began asserting themselves. 300 cavalry against 20,000. The column was compressing from both flanks now, the corridor closing behind them as fast as it opened ahead. Adrian could feel the edges of the column being stripped, individual riders pulled from formation, the fighting density around him increasing as the open ground disappeared. He kept driving forward. The warlord's banner was visible ahead. The spear came from the left, not the intercontinental weapon but a standard throw, still enormously powerful. It caught the horse to Adrian's right, and in the chaos of the animal going down, something struck Adrian's head from behind. A thrown object, a displaced piece of equipment, something that connected with enough force that his vision closed briefly. He was still in the saddle. He was not conscious. He became conscious again, horizontal, not moving, with the unmistakable sound of close combat on all sides, and Captain Kwan's voice in his ear saying things with the controlled urgency of someone saying things a second time because the first time hadn't produced a response. Kwan was a garrison officer, senior cavalry, 15 years of service, the kind of capable officer that frontier postings produced and the capital rarely saw. He had the prince across his saddle, with the practical efficiency of someone who had been given a specific order and was executing it. The order had come from Count Bale. Adrian's vision cleared enough to read the situation. The column had fragmented, some still driving forward, some being pulled into isolated engagements. The Silver Fox left column fighting a controlled retreat back toward the castle. Kwan was moving in the retreat direction with 3 cavalry escorts forming a moving defensive shell around them. Adrian tried to get upright. Kwan told him to stay down with the tone of a man who had been authorized to enforce this instruction if necessary. He looked back. Count Bale was not retreating. He was ahead of where the column had been, past the point where the defensive shell of orc units had reformed, pushing toward the warlord's banner on a line that no individual rider at his cultivations should have been able to maintain through that density of opposition. He was not at quad chain output. The signature coming from him was different, changed at a fundamental level. The chain structure that Adrian's heart sense had read for 3 months, reorganized into something that had resolved past the quad ceiling. Pentachain. The ancient soul understood what it was seeing. The courtyard at midnight, the 2 hours of explanation about the heart's principle, the 14 days of siege giving Bale's cultivation the specific emotional material that the 5th chain required. Not ambition, not discipline, but something more irreversible. The chains that the mana formed at the penta level were not built from training. They were built from the willingness to spend something that couldn't be taken back. He had found it. He drove into the warlord's defensive ring at the full output of a pentachain knight, and the Orc King met him with the massive physical authority of a creature that had reached its own pinnacle through a different route and was not accustomed to finding anything at this distance that required full engagement. Adrian couldn't see the outcome from Kwan's saddle. He heard it. The quality of the combat sounds from that position changed, became denser, became something that required a very high level of power on both sides to produce. He heard it continue for 40 seconds, which was a long time for an engagement at that scale. Then it stopped. The orc encampment's organized command behavior fractured afterward. Not immediately, not completely, but enough that the retreat corridors opened more than the mathematics of the sortie alone should have allowed. Enough that Kwan got his charge and the 3 escorts back through the gate with the particular brutal efficiency of men who understood they were carrying something that mattered. Inside the gate, Adrian got to his feet. He stood. He looked at the castle walls and at the garrison soldiers who were covering the retreat, and at the gate being sealed behind the last cavalry riders who made it back. Count Bale was not among them. Winter Castle held for 1 more day. It held because the garrison had not been built by hope, and because the people inside it understood, without anyone stating it explicitly, that what had happened in the field meant the price of holding was already paid, and all that remained was to honor the transaction. On the 15th day, the eastern wall section failed. It did not fail from structural weakness. It failed because 20,000 orcs, reorganizing their assault coherence after the disruption of the charge's aftermath, applied simultaneous pressure at 3 connected points that the reduced garrison could not cover simultaneously at full defensive capacity. The breach was small at first, then the breach was larger. Adrian ordered the retreat at the moment the breach became irreversible. Not before. He needed the timing precise, the retreating force moving while enough defensive pressure remained on the walls to prevent the withdrawal corridor from being cut before the column cleared it. The withdrawal ran along the route Iras's scouts had prepared. 3 corridors, all provisioned, all assessed for winter weather, all passable in the dark with the guide markers the mercenaries had placed. The garrison moved in organized sections, each one departing at staggered intervals, with rear guards that held each corridor section until the main group cleared it. Vincent ran the rear guard of the 3rd corridor himself. He came in last, before the corridor was sealed, with 4 rangers behind him and a cut along his jaw that had bled heavily and stopped on its own. He delivered his section's status report, with the focused efficiency of someone who had been doing this for a specific purpose, and was maintaining that purpose until it was complete. His father's name was not in the report. The report covered operational outcomes. Adrian heard the report. He received it without indicating he registered what was absent from it. There would be a time for that. This was not it. Winter Castle burned behind them. They did not watch it burn. The 2nd Defensive Line's camp was a collection of existing garrison posts and supply depots expanded hastily into a functional headquarters. Functional in the minimum necessary sense, which meant command structures were present and supply chains were established and people had somewhere to put their equipment, but which also bore unmistakably the marks of a force that had just come from a place that no longer existed. The mainland lords arrived on the 2nd day. They arrived with their private garrisons intact, men who had spent the siege holding domestic positions and were now presenting themselves at the 2nd line with the composed confidence of people who had made reasonable decisions about resource allocation and were prepared to discuss cooperative arrangements going forward. Count Guron brought 400 soldiers and a military secretary who was apparently there to take notes on the coordination meeting. Count Hein arrived separately, several hours later, with 300 and a legal advisor. They set up in the large garrison tent, the command space, the proper venue for senior lords to meet and discuss the strategic situation. They sent a formal invitation to the first prince of the kingdom to attend the coordination meeting at his earliest convenience. The garrison soldiers who had come from Winter Castle watched this through the camp's fence lines with expressions that the lords, engaged in their arrival logistics, did not notice or did not choose to notice. Adrian received the invitation while speaking with Vincent about the scout assessment of the Orc army's current advance rate from the fallen castle. He read it, he set it on the field table. He told Vincent that the advance assessment was the priority and asked him to continue. They finished the assessment. It confirmed what the preliminary mathematics had suggested. The Orc main force was reorganizing after the disruption of the cavalry charge, and the advance toward the 2nd line was running at a pace that suggested 4 or 5 days before arrival in force. 4 days. Adrian put the scout assessment in the command record. He changed into the winter coat he hadn't had occasion to wear since the castle's heated interior had rendered it optional. He picked up his sword and walked to the large garrison tent. The lords were seated when he entered, Guron at the table's head, which was a specific choice about how the space was being organized, Hine to his left, several staff members and the legal advisor distributed around the perimeter. They were in the middle of a sentence about jurisdictional coordination when the tent flap opened. Guron finished his sentence. He looked at Adrian with the expression of a senior lord in his established position, receiving a visiting royal, professionally courteous, comfortable with the arrangement of the room, expecting the standard diplomatic registers of a coordination conversation. Adrian crossed the tent floor to where Count Guron was seated and drew his sword in the same movement, and what followed was brief and final and held a specific quality of decisiveness that left no procedural ambiguity about what had occurred or who had done it. Count Hein had time to stand before the second decision was made. The legal advisor was on his feet with his mouth open, the documents he'd been holding scattered across the floor. The military secretary had moved to the tent's far edge by the time Adrian turned to face the remaining people in the room. He looked at each face in turn. The staff members of both lords, the advisors, the officers who had come in with the garrisons, all of them receiving the full weight of the silence that follows something irreversible. He said, in the quiet voice of someone making a statement of fact to people who were going to need to act on it quickly, that the Northern Military Command was now consolidated. He said the private garrisons of the deceased lords were now Northern Frontier Force assets under his direct authority. He said the second defensive line would be fully operational and under unified command before the Orc advance reached engagement distance. He said anyone who disagreed with this arrangement was welcome to leave the Northern Territory immediately and explain their disagreement to the Crown in writing, and that the record of communications sent and ignored over the past 15 days was available as context for that conversation. He said all of this without raising his voice. The steadiness of it was, in its own way, more unambiguous than volume would have been. He sheathed his sword. He told the senior officer of Garon's private garrison that his troops would be integrated into the eastern wall position within the hour. He told Hine's senior officer the same regarding the northern approach. He told the Silver Fox captain present that Irast should prepare her unit for forward observation starting at dawn. He walked to the table, moved Guron's materials to the edge, spread the scout assessment he'd been carrying, and asked if anyone in the room had terrain information about the second line's eastern approach that wasn't in the current survey. For a moment, no one moved. Then a garrison officer from Hines' force, a weathered man who had the posture of someone who had spent years in actual frontier service regardless of whose banner he'd been assigned to, stepped forward and said he had information about the eastern approach. He moved to the table and pointed to a section of the survey map. 2 minutes later, 4 others had joined them. Adrian was alone in the command tent at the hour past midnight. The camp was as quiet as it ever was. The night watch rotation, the distant sound of horses in the temporary stable line, the wind coming off the mountains. The mountains that the Orc warlord was somewhere behind, with his force reorganizing and moving and carrying the fact of Winter Castle's ash as evidence of what this campaign was. The notebook was on the table. Forel's name was the most recent entry. He wrote Count Bale's name below it. He wrote it carefully, because the ancient soul that had stood at the founding of this kingdom had accompanied a great many deaths across centuries and had developed, not immunity, but a very specific understanding of what each one cost and why that cost mattered. Immunity would have been easier. The understanding was more honest. He closed the notebook. Outside, the second defensive line was preparing, integrating the newly absorbed garrison forces, running the revised resonance loop rehearsal with the expanded numbers, pre-positioning supply for a siege that would begin in 4 days. The northern frontier that had held for 30 years under Count Bale Valorhard's command had a different structure now. It was lighter in some ways, more consolidated, more dangerous in the specific way that things are dangerous when they have been reduced to their essential elements and no longer carry anything that isn't load-bearing. The Orc warlord had an army. The second defensive line had 1,200 consolidated soldiers, 300 Silver Fox mercenaries, 1 ranger corps, and 1 entity that had built its entire identity across centuries from the practice of refusing to yield ground that mattered. The mathematics were still unfavorable. Gruhorn had never particularly cared about mathematics. The ancient consciousness had survived worse equations than this one, in worse conditions, with less preparation. What it had always cared about, what it had been shaped by, across every war it had fought, every generation of Leonberger blood it had watched, was the question of whether the people doing the defending understood what they were defending and why. These ones did. The Orc horde would reach the second line in 4 days. The northern lords who had tried to watch from a safe distance had been eliminated. The nobles who had counted on political maneuvering to insulate them from consequence had discovered that consequence operated on its own schedule. What remained was the work. The ancient soul sat in the command tent of a fortress that hadn't existed 3 weeks ago, in a body that hadn't been worth anything 6 months ago, holding a notebook with names in it that would never be discussed in the royal capital's comfortable halls, and it understood, with the deep clarity of something that had been paying attention for a very long time, that the North was not going to fall while it was present. It had rebuilt a kingdom once from worse materials than this. It intended to do it again.